Welcome to Back to the Bible with pastor and Bible teacher Bryan Clark. All this month, Bryan will be focusing on the birth of Christ. We trust this will deepen your relationship with God as you prepare your heart for the true meaning of Christmas. Now let's join Bryan for today's inspiring message.
I always marvel at Christmas time how widespread the message of Christmas is around the world. The culture is absolutely saturated with the message of the gospel. Even if you just consider it through the music, the Christmas carols. If you really pay attention to the words of the Christmas carols, they are some of the richest theology that we have. The message of the gospel, it's all there. The whole story is there. It's in the malls, it's on the radio, it's on television, it is everywhere. And yet most people just don't get it. I mean, how can they sing these songs and somehow completely disconnect from the message? But they do. You know, just because people can recite back the basic information of Christmas doesn't mean that they understand it. It doesn't mean that they understand the meaning, and it certainly doesn't mean that they have affirmed the message of the gospel. So what does Christmas mean? What is it really all about? Well, one of the best ways to understand Christmas is to realize it wasn't just an event that happened out of nowhere that caught everyone off guard. It was part of God's plan that has been unfolding for thousands of years. As a matter of fact, after Jesus had risen from the dead, he was talking with his disciples, and he said to them, "You should have understood what I was going to do." He said, "It was written in the writings of Moses," which would be the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He said it was written in the prophets. It was written in the Psalms. In other words, Jesus was saying, this whole book has always been about me and what I would do to redeem mankind. One of the problems with having an Old Testament and a New Testament is sometimes we think that implies the Old Testament was for them, the New Testament is for us. That's not true. It's been one unfolding story all the way through. Sometimes we think, well, the people in the Old Testament got saved this way, but we get saved that way. No, that's not true. It's always been the same way. You say, well, yeah, but the God of the Old Testament is a God of wrath and anger, and the God of the New Testament is a God of love, as if God had some conversion experience somewhere along the way. The God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, it's the same God. He said himself, he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Yeah, but the Old Testament was about law, and the New Testament's about grace. That's not true. Jacob's received more grace than anyone in the Bible. God is a God of grace from Genesis to Revelation. It's just the unfolding of one story of how God is going to redeem sinful people from their sins. Well, in order to make that case and to better understand it, I thought maybe we would understand the meaning of Christmas by going back to Genesis. Because the reality is we can understand everything that Christmas is about without ever leaving the book of Genesis. Now, the question might arise, how do we know that? How do we know that you're not just making this all up? I mean, how do we know that you're not just reading all this into those pictures? That's a great question, because we don't want to read all kinds of stuff into those texts that God didn't intend. For every one of these images in the book of Genesis that I'm going to say is a picture of Christ, there are New Testament passages that would support that that is true. In other words, I can go to the New Testament, and the New Testament says, yes, that is what that was about in Genesis. So that would be the support to say, yeah, we're not making this up, we're not reading it into it. You can go to those New Testament passages, and they will quote the Genesis passage and say, yes, this is what it's about. It's all about Christ. If you have a Bible, turn with me to Genesis chapter 2, the first 3 verses. It says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. By the seventh day God completed his work which he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Of course, Genesis 1 is all about God speaking the universe into place. And then we're told that on the seventh day, God rested. And God rested because he was exhausted. It's hard work creating the universe. Well, of course not. I mean, all God did was speak. I mean, I speak. That certainly didn't exhaust God. The point in those three verses is raised over and over again. As a matter of fact, the repetition is such that we would say, okay, I get it. God rested because the work was done. God rested because the work was done. God rested because the work was done. It says it 3 times. So it wasn't that God was worn out or exhausted. It's because the work was done. Now, this will be a critical concept that will unfold in the book of Genesis that we must understand. It would be the foundation for eventually under the law, the coming of the Sabbath day and what that represented, and then what's ultimately fulfilled in Christ. So for now, all we want to do is kind of lock that away, and we're going to talk about it more in just a few minutes. Next, chapter 3. Of course, this is the story of the fall of mankind. God has created a perfect paradise. And he's taken Adam and Eve and he's placed them in paradise. Now, in my opinion, this is the first statement of grace in the Bible. Even before sin enters into the picture, there's grace, because that's God, that's who he is.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, you'll find today's program along with older messages at backtothebible.org. And while you're there, browse our devotions, Bible studies, and Bible plans. You'll find a wide variety there, all designed to help you experience a deeper relationship with Jesus. That's at backtothebible.org. Visit today, backtothebible.org. Now let's return to our program.
Adam and Eve didn't earn or deserve paradise. They were simply placed in paradise in an act of grace. But the serpent comes along and he starts to raise the question as to whether or not God is as good as they think he is. And maybe there's more life outside of God's plan, outside of God's purpose, and maybe they're settling for less. Maybe they need to think about more. And they start to think about that, and maybe that's true. And maybe they can be their own gods and decide for themselves what's right and wrong. And all of that starts to resonate, and they finally choose to disobey God. And at that point, they are immediately aware of their own nakedness before God, and the shame of their sin causes them to hide from God. Now, Genesis 3 is one of the most tragic chapters in all of the Bible, because they are then put out of paradise because of their sin. But in the midst of this tragedy, what seems to be a great victory for the serpent, God speaks to the serpent, and in his words we hear the first hope of redemption. Verse 15, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. And he shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel." God speaks to the serpent and says, you may think you have won, but I'm telling you something, that through the seed of a woman, in other words, a man, through the seed of a woman will come one whom you will bruise on his heel, but he, the seed of the woman, will crush your head. And God saying, I will ultimately win. That's believed to be the first statement that God will do whatever is necessary to make it possible for sinful men and women once again to go back to paradise. God is saying, I will ultimately triumph. I will bring life from death. Did Adam understand this? Yes, I think he did. Look at verse 20. Adam names the woman, and he names her Eve, which means mother of the living. Now that's an odd name for Eve, because what has just happened is Adam and Eve have sinned, and the consequence of their sin is death. and they have begun a process of dying. And so he should have named her Mother of the Dying, because that was the case. So why did Adam name her Mother of the Living? Because Adam understood that God said, I will do what's necessary. I've made a promise to bring life out of death. And Adam's way of saying, I believe that, was to name Eve Mother of the Living, because God would bring life from death. You also see it in verse 21, where we're told that for the first time there was death. That's the first time there was ever death in all of eternity. But it wasn't Adam and Eve that died. It was an animal that shed its blood so that the shame of their nakedness could be covered. Now you start to hear the imagery here, that a substitute would shed its blood in order to cover the shame of sin. So we're just getting little hints here of what is to come. Chapter 12. God calls Abram out of the Ur of the Chaldees to be a called out people, and through Abram would be the promised seed. In verse 2, God says to Abram, and I will make you a great nation, which means descendants, sons, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. If we take the earlier statement in Genesis 3 with this, then the seed of the woman is going to come through the line of Abraham. And through that line, all the families of the earth will be blessed. If you were to go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, Matthew opens up with, this is the genealogy of Jesus, son of David, son of Abraham. Because Matthew is taking that all the way back, saying Jesus was a son of Abraham, just as God had promised. Well, the story fills out greatly then in chapter 15. In chapter 15, God restates the covenant promise to Abraham and tells him that he will have his son, and through this son will come this promised seed. Chapter 15, verse 6 is the critical verse, and Abram believed, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. That's in accounting terms. It means it was credited to his account as righteousness. This is the conversion moment for Abraham. As a matter of fact, the Apostle Paul would spend an entire chapter in Romans chapter 4, discussing this verse. And the reality that Abram was not saved, was not declared righteous because of his religious works, because of his circumcision, because of anything other than his faith. He believed when God made his promise. But I do think Abraham was struggling with his insecurities. So he raises the question, God, how can I know that this is going to happen? How can I know that this covenant's going to be kept? Now, I don't think he's questioning God. He's questioning himself. God, we're entering into this covenant, but what if I fail? How can I know that this will come to pass? And so God says, Abraham, we're going to cut a covenant here. I want you to get a ram and a heifer and a goat. I want you to get a pigeon, and I want you to get a turtle dove. And then he did something that would have been very common to the people in the ancient Near East, very uncommon to us. Said, I want you to cut them in half and lay the halves so that they face one another. And they would do this on the side of a hill so that the blood would run down into a trough at the bottom in a valley. And it would create a pool of blood. What was typically done in the ancient world then is the two people that were entering into the covenant, typically the two kings, they would walk through the blood. They would pass through the blood, and it would splash up on their ankles and their legs. And the symbolism was such that they were saying, if I fail to keep my part of the covenant, this is what you may do to me. We sometimes refer to cutting a covenant And this is where the language comes from the ancient Near East. That's how they cut a covenant. That's how they cut a deal.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, you'll find today's program along with older messages at backtothebible.org. And while you're there, browse our devotions, Bible studies, and Bible plans. You'll find a wide variety there, all designed to help you experience a deeper relationship with Jesus. That's at backtothebible.org. Visit today, backtothebible.org. Now let's return to our program.
But in this particular case, God has Abraham lay this all out, and then the writer's very careful to say Abraham was fast asleep. He wasn't just asleep. It says he was in a deep sleep. In other words, Abraham was resting. God was working. Okay, that's the imagery here. It's God alone, pictured as a flaming torch in a smoking oven, who walks through the blood. And that was God's way of saying, Abraham, this is a unilateral covenant. It's all about me. And if you or I fail to keep the covenant, it will be my blood that will be shed in order to make it right. That was God's promise to Abraham. Well, of course, we hear that language then in the New Testament. It was Jesus himself who, on the night he was to be arrested, held up the Passover wine glass and said, "This is my blood," bringing in the new covenant. In other words, Jesus was saying, this was the fulfillment of the promise that I made to Abraham. That because of your inability to keep the covenant, because of your sin, I am now going to shed my blood to make it right. I mean, the New Testament is full of statements that without the shedding of the blood of Christ, there is no forgiveness of sin. So the promise was that it would be a seed of a woman, and that seed of the woman would ultimately crush the head of the serpent, would triumph over sin, bring life out of death. And the seed of the woman would come through the line of Abraham, so he would be a man. But now we're told not only would he be a man, but he would be God. He would be a God-man. And would be the God-man who would shed his blood to atone for sin. Did Abraham understand this? Yes, he did. In John chapter 8, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and Jesus says, you know, Abraham looked forward to see my day. That's what Jesus said. And he could see it. He saw it. Now, Jesus is saying that Abraham looked forward to the day when Jesus would come, when God would shed his blood for his sin, and Abraham actually saw that day through the eyes of faith. Through the eyes of faith. So Jesus affirmed that Abraham did understand, and he believed. And it was credited to his account as righteousness. So for thousands of years, every day at 3 o'clock, the priest would bring the animal to the altar and would sacrifice the animal. And the blood would flow over the rocks, and the priest understood that the blood of that animal was not adequate to atone for sin, but was merely symbolic of God's promise that he would shed his blood for the forgiveness of sin. So they understood that sacrifice to be merely a symbol of the promise God made to Abraham that would be fulfilled in Jesus. Galatians 3, Acts 3, a number of New Testament passages affirm that Jesus was indeed the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham. John read the passage this morning. God became flesh and dwelt among us, but it was in fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham. Genesis 17. In chapter 16, Abraham and Sarah have a little crisis of faith. They're getting up in years and they have had no sons. They begin to think it's not going to happen, so they decide to come up with their own plan and have Abraham have a son through the maid. Well, that just creates a big mess, and God comes back in chapter 17 and says, no, we're not going to do that. This promised seed is going to come through you and Sarah. I promised, and I'll keep my promise. And Abraham believes that. Now, there was reason for concern. By the time Isaac was born, Abraham was 100 years old. Sarah was 90 years old. We might say that's a little beyond childbearing years. But the New Testament would say that at this point in Abraham and Sarah's life, they were as good as dead in their ability to have a child. In other words, the only way they could have a child at that age in life is it would have to be a miracle. It would have to be a gift from God. It would have to be something only God could do. And of course, that was God's plan. God wanted Abraham and Sarah to reach a point where they would understand, you can't do this. This will have to be something that I do. So Abraham believed that. And God said, okay, to establish this belief, in order to affirm that you believe this, we're going to establish a sign for the covenant. And that will be circumcision. Now, we here in the 21st century, we look at this circumcision thing and we say, what? I mean, what's up with that? I mean, can't they come up with a better sign than that? But you have to understand the symbolism of all that. Going all the way back to Genesis 3, that there would be a seed of the woman that would come through the line of Abraham, that would be God in the flesh, and he would shed his blood for our inability to keep the covenant. And so the symbolism was on the male organ through which that seed would be passed. So you say, okay, that makes sense. The removal of the flesh of the foreskin is a way of saying that there is no ability in their flesh to accomplish this. So the discarding of that flesh was a way of saying we die to a belief that we can do this ourselves. Therefore, we believe it will have to be a miracle from God. And that was the symbolism of circumcision.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, you'll find today's program along with older messages at backtothebible.org. And while you're there, browse our devotions, Bible studies, and Bible plans. You'll find a wide variety there, all designed to help you experience a deeper relationship with Jesus. Visit today, backtothebible.org.